FBI Director Elijah Washington stares down the barrel of a police officer's gun, his credentials ignored on the passenger seat. Blood trickles from his temple where Officer Keller struck him. "Sir, I need you to comply," Keller says, unaware that 20 security cameras are recording his every move. Before we dive into this shocking story of racial injustice and the fight for accountability, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Hit that like button and subscribe if you want more stories about brave individuals standing against systemic racism. Can you imagine being the highest-ranking law enforcement official in the country and still facing racial profiling? What would you do in Washington's position with a gun pointed at your head? Let's find out what happened in the next part of this incredible true story. FBI Director Elijah Washington adjusted his tie in the mirror of his Georgetown home, mentally preparing for his trip to Atlanta. At 55 years old, with salt and pepper hair cut close to his scalp and eyes that carried both wisdom and weariness, Washington had reached the pinnacle of American law enforcement. Today would mark his 17th month as FBI Director, but this trip wasn't about celebrating milestones. He was traveling to Atlanta to meet with civil rights leaders about his police reform initiatives, a passion project born from personal experience. Growing up on Chicago's South Side, Washington had seen firsthand how law enforcement could either protect or persecute communities of color. His father, a postal worker who raised 3 children alone after Washington's mother died of cancer, had drilled into him the importance of education and integrity. "They can take almost everything from you," his father would say, "but they can't take what's in your head or your heart." Washington had worked his way through college on scholarships and part-time jobs, graduating with honors from Northwestern before attending Harvard Law School. Joining the FBI had been a controversial choice among his friends, many of whom viewed federal law enforcement with deep suspicion. "You're going into the lion's den," his best friend Marcus had warned. Washington had simply nodded and replied, "Sometimes that's where you need to be to make change." His early years at the Bureau had been marked by subtle and not-so-subtle discrimination. He remembered his first supervisor, Agent Blanchard, who seemed to review his reports with extra scrutiny and assigned him to document filing while sending white agents with less experience into the field. Then there was the time in 2002 when he'd apprehended a suspect after a lengthy chase, only to have local police officers handcuff him alongside the suspect until his white partner arrived to confirm his identity. Despite these obstacles, Washington had risen through the ranks through sheer brilliance, integrity, and strategic patience. He'd led the Chicago field office, then become assistant director, and finally, after the previous director retired, the president had nominated him. The confirmation hearings had been brutal, with several senators questioning whether he could be objective about police misconduct given his race. Washington had responded with dignity, "My experience as a black man in America doesn't bias me, it informs me." Now, as director, he had initiated an ambitious program to reform police departments nationwide through training, accountability measures, and community engagement. This trip to Atlanta was part of that effort, a chance to meet directly with community leaders rather than just police brass. Washington's security coordinator, Agent Reynolds, knocked on his bedroom door. "Sir, I need to review the security arrangements for Atlanta again." Washington sighed. "Come in, Reynolds." The younger agent entered, tablet in hand. "Sir, I must again express my concerns about you traveling without the full motorcade. At minimum, we should have 4 agents with you at all times." Washington shook his head. "Reynolds, I've explained this. I'm going to meet with community leaders who are already skeptical of federal law enforcement. Arriving with a massive security detail sends exactly the wrong message." Reynolds frowned. "Then at least let us drive you, sir." An unmarked car with one of our agents at the wheel. Washington considered this, then shook his head again. "No. I'll drive myself in a Bureau sedan. Low profile, just as planned. I need these community members to see me as accessible, not hiding behind a wall of agents." Reynolds looked like he might protest further, but instead nodded reluctantly. Yes, sir. The vehicle will be ready at 0600. I've arranged for additional security at the hotel and meeting venue. Washington nodded. Thank you, Reynolds. That's more than sufficient. As Reynolds left, Washington's phone rang. It was Assistant Director Monica Chen, his most trusted colleague. Elijah, please tell me you're not still planning to drive yourself around Atlanta. Washington chuckled. Hello to you too, Monica. Chen wasn't amused. This isn't a joke. You're the FBI director. There are protocols for a reason. Washington sat on the edge of his bed. Monica, we've discussed this. I can't effectively advocate for community policing if I'm completely isolated from the community. Chen sighed. At least promise me you'll stay on main roads and avoid driving at night. Washington smiled. Yes, Mother. After hanging up, Washington packed his briefcase with the files he'd review on the flight to Atlanta. His mind was already running through the key points he wanted to make. In tomorrow's meeting, the need for robust civilian oversight boards, transparency in use of force incidents, and comprehensive bias training. What he didn't know was that across town at the Department of Justice, a confidential report had just landed on the Attorney General's desk, highlighting the Atlanta Police Department as having one of the highest rates of racial disparity in traffic stops in the nation. Meanwhile, at Atlanta Police Department's precinct, 6 Officer Richard Keller was receiving his patrol assignment for the following day. At 42, Keller was a 15-year veteran of the force with a record that should have raised red flags years ago. He had 17 excessive force complaints, all dismissed or settled quietly. 12 of those complaints came from black citizens. Keller sat in the briefing room half listening as Sergeant Willis outlined the day's priorities. We've got increased patrols in Buckhead after those break-ins last week, Willis was saying. Keller, I want you on the north section focusing on Peachtree Road and the surrounding neighborhoods. Keller nodded, scratching his thinning blond hair. Any particular houses I should keep an eye on? Willis shook his head. Just general patrol, but be alert. These perps are coming in from the south side. Keller smirked at the implication. Everyone knew South Side was code for black neighborhoods. After the briefing, Keller lingered in the break room with Officers Simmons and Daniels. Did you hear they're sending some black FBI bigwig to lecture us on how to do our jobs? Simmons said, stirring his coffee. Keller's jaw tightened. Yeah, I heard. Another desk jockey who's never worked a real beat telling us how to handle the streets. Daniels, the youngest of the 3, looked uncomfortable. I heard he actually came up through field offices, has a good record. Keller shot him a look. Whose side are you on? Rookie. We. Daniels fell silent. Keller drained his coffee and stood. I'm heading home. Early shift tomorrow. As he drove to his modest home in the suburbs, Keller brooded over the changes in the department in recent years. The new mayor was black. The police chief was a black woman. Now the FBI was sending some black director to tell them what they were doing wrong. It felt like his world was being taken from him, piece by piece. At home, Keller cleaned his service weapon meticulously, as he did every night. His wife had left 2 years ago, taking their daughter to Florida. The house was quiet, except for the TV news droning in the background. The anchor was talking about FBI Director Washington's upcoming visit to discuss police reform. Keller switched the channel. That night, 2 men prepared for sleep, unaware that their paths would cross with life-altering consequences. In Georgetown, Washington reviewed his notes one last time before setting his alarm. In suburban Atlanta, Keller set out his uniform for the morning shift, his mind filled with resentment. Neither man could have predicted how their brief encounter would shake the foundations of law enforcement across America. The Atlanta morning greeted FBI Director Elijah Washington with perfect spring weather, clear skies, and temperatures in the 60s. He had arrived late the previous night and slept well at the downtown hotel. Now, at 7:30 in the morning, he was driving the unmarked Bureau sedan through Buckhead on his way to a breakfast meeting with Reverend James Wilson, a prominent civil rights leader. Washington had decided to take a scenic route, partly to see more of the city and partly to gather his thoughts before the meeting. The reform proposals he was presenting today had been months in the making, and he wanted everything to go perfectly. As he drove along Peachtree Road, Washington mentally rehearsed his opening remarks. "Meaningful reform requires both accountability and trust," he would say. "We cannot have one without the other." He believed this deeply, having witnessed both excellent and horrific policing throughout his career. Washington was so absorbed in his thoughts that he almost missed the police cruiser pulling up behind him, lights flashing. Glancing at his speedometer, he confirmed he hadn't been speeding. Perhaps a taillight was out. He signaled and pulled smoothly to the curb, remembering the protocol he had learned decades ago and had taught to countless citizens during community outreach events: turn off the engine. Place hands visibly on the steering wheel. Wait for the officer to approach. Officer Richard Keller had spotted the dark sedan with tinted windows turning onto Peachtree Road from a side street. Something about the vehicle triggered his suspicion, though he would later be unable to articulate exactly what. The car was driving exactly at the speed limit, signaling properly for lane changes, and had no visible equipment violations. Nevertheless, Keller decided to run the plates. The vehicle came back as a rental registered to a company often used by government agencies. This increased rather than decreased Keller's suspicion. He flipped on his lights and pulled the sedan over. As he approached the vehicle, Keller noted the driver was a well-dressed black man. His hand instinctively moved closer to his holster, a habit formed over years of what he called street survival, but what department psychologists might have identified as racial bias. "License and registration," Keller demanded without introducing himself or explaining the reason for the stop. Washington kept his hands visible on the steering wheel. "Officer, may I ask why I've been pulled over?" His tone was polite but direct. Keller's expression hardened. "License and registration first. Then we can discuss why I stopped you." Washington nodded calmly. "My wallet is in my inner jacket pocket, and the rental agreement is in the glove compartment. I'm going to reach for them now, if that's all right." Keller didn't respond but watched intently as Washington slowly reached for his wallet. Washington extracted his ID and held it out along with his FBI credentials, which were in the same wallet case. "Officer, I'm FBI Director Elijah Washington. I'm in Atlanta for official business." Keller glanced at the identification but made no move to take it. His expression showed disbelief. "FBI Director, right. And I'm the Attorney General. Let me see some real ID." Washington remained calm. "Sir, these are my actual credentials. If you'd like to verify, you can call the Atlanta field office. They're expecting me this morning." Keller's face flushed with anger. "Step out of the vehicle, sir." Washington hesitated. "Officer, there seems to be a misunderstanding. These are legitimate federal credentials." Keller's hand moved to his holster. "I said step out of the vehicle, now." Washington recognized the escalating danger. Moving very deliberately, he placed his credentials on the passenger seat, unbuckled his seatbelt, and opened the door slowly. "I'm complying, officer. I'm unarmed." As Washington stood, Keller immediately grabbed his arm and pushed him against the side of the car. "Hands on the vehicle, spread your legs." Washington complied, still trying to reason with the officer. "Sir, my credentials are legitimate. I'm the director of the FBI. This is a misunderstanding that we can clear up with one phone call." Keller began patting him down roughly. "Sure you are. And what's the FBI director doing driving himself around Buckhead at 7:30 in the morning?" Washington kept his voice steady. "I'm here for meetings with community leaders about police reform initiatives. My credentials are on the passenger seat. Please check them." Keller ignored the request and continued the pat-down. Finding nothing, his frustration seemed to grow. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" The implication was clear. Washington felt a familiar anger rising, but kept it contained. "As I said, I'm here on official business. My credentials will confirm my identity." Keller seemed determined to escalate the situation. "I think you're using a fake ID. Impersonating a federal officer is a serious crime." Washington took a deep breath. "Officer, I understand you're doing your job, but this is a significant mistake. I am who I say I am." Something in Washington's composed demeanor seemed to further aggravate Keller. "Turn around," he ordered. When Washington complied, Keller suddenly grabbed him by the collar and slammed him against the car. Washington's head hit the roof of the sedan, opening a cut on his temple. Blood began to trickle down the side of his face. "Officer, this is unnecessary," Washington said, still maintaining his composure despite the pain. "You're assaulting a federal officer." Keller's response was to wrench Washington's arms behind his back. "Stop resisting!" he shouted, though Washington was offering no resistance. "I'm not resisting," Washington replied calmly. "I'm cooperating fully." It was at this moment that residents of a nearby house noticed the confrontation. James and Marie Cooper, an older couple, having breakfast on their porch, saw the officer's aggressive behavior. "James, that officer is being very rough with that man," Marie said worriedly. James stood up for a better look. "That doesn't look right at all. The gentleman isn't fighting back." He pulled out his phone and began recording. Other neighbors noticed as well. Across the street, Marcus Johnson, a 34-year-old black community organizer, was leaving for work when he spotted the incident. He immediately recognized Washington from news coverage of his appointment. "Oh my God," he muttered, pulling out his phone. "That's the FBI director." He began recording and narrating quietly. "I'm witnessing Officer Badge number 753 manhandling FBI Director Elijah Washington during what appears to be a routine traffic stop in Buckhead, Atlanta." The situation continued to deteriorate. Keller, still ignoring Washington's credentials on the passenger seat, drew his weapon. "I'm going to give you one more chance to tell me what you're really doing here before I place you under arrest for impersonating a federal officer." Washington, now with a gun pointed at him, maintained his remarkable composure. "Officer, I am FBI Director Elijah Washington. My credentials are in plain view on the passenger seat. I'm asking you professionally to verify my identity before this situation escalates further." Keller, weapon still aimed at Washington, used his radio to call for backup. "This is Officer Keller. I've got a suspicious individual claiming to be the FBI director, requesting backup on Peachtree Road near Piedmont intersection." As he made the call, more residents emerged from their homes' phones recording. Marcus Johnson had begun live streaming the incident, his voice tight with controlled outrage. "I'm watching an Atlanta PD officer pointing a gun at FBI Director Elijah Washington during a traffic stop. The director is bleeding from his head and has his hands up. His identification is clearly visible in the car." By now, at least a dozen witnesses were recording, and Marcus's live stream was beginning to attract viewers. What had begun as a routine traffic stop was rapidly evolving into a national incident that would force America to confront some uncomfortable truths about law enforcement and race. The next 5 minutes became the most scrutinized moments in recent law enforcement history, dissected frame by frame on news programs, in congressional hearings, and in police academies nationwide. Every second was captured from multiple angles as more residents began recording. FBI Director Elijah Washington stood absolutely still, blood running down the side of his face, staring into the barrel of Officer Richard Keller's service weapon. In Washington's mind, time slowed to a crawl. His FBI training kicked in automatically as he assessed his options, which were dangerously limited. Any sudden movement could trigger a fatal response from the increasingly agitated officer. Washington had investigated dozens of police shootings during his career cases where black men had died after reaching for wallets, cell phones, or even nothing at all. "Sir, I need you to lower your weapon," Washington said, his voice remarkably steady. "We can resolve this situation professionally." Keller's hand trembled slightly, but the gun remained pointed at Washington's chest. "Stop telling me what to do. You don't give the orders here." Washington noted the officer's escalating agitation and recognized the danger signs. He'd seen them before in case files of police shootings gone wrong: the elevated voice, the physical tension, the inability to process contradictory information. This officer was in tunnel vision, a dangerous psychological state where rational thought became secondary to perceived threat response. "Officer Keller," Washington said deliberately, using the name he'd heard over the radio, "I understand you're doing your job. I respect that, but I need you to understand that I am who I claim to be." Washington was acutely aware of the growing audience. From the corner of his eye, he could see security cameras mounted on nearby homes, their lenses capturing everything. At least 15 residents now stood on their lawns or porches, smartphones recording the unfolding drama. Marcus Johnson had positioned himself with a clear view, his live stream now attracting thousands of viewers as social media algorithms detected the extraordinary content. "This is Marcus Johnson live from Buckhead, Atlanta," he narrated quietly. "I'm witnessing FBI Director Elijah Washington being held at gunpoint by an Atlanta police officer during what appears to be a routine traffic stop. The director is bleeding from his head, but remaining incredibly calm." Washington could hear Marcus's voice and realized the incident was already going viral. In the FBI Director's office in Washington, D.C., Assistant Director Monica Chen was reviewing morning briefings when an alert flashed on her screen. The Bureau's social media monitoring system had flagged a live stream mentioning the director. Clicking the link, Chen's face drained of color. "Oh my God!" she gasped, immediately hitting the emergency protocol button that would mobilize the director's security team. Back in Atlanta, Washington maintained eye contact with Keller. "Officer, I want to cooperate fully. My credentials are on the passenger seat. Would you like me to have someone else retrieve them for you?" Keller's jaw tightened. "Nobody moves. Backup is on the way." Washington nodded slowly. "That's fine. When they arrive, they can verify my identity." 3 minutes had now passed since the gun was drawn. In that time, Marcus Johnson's live stream had jumped to over 20,000 viewers. Local news stations had been alerted and were dispatching crews. The Atlanta FBI field office had received multiple calls, including an emergency alert from Assistant Director Chen. Washington heard approaching sirens from multiple directions. He knew that the next 60 seconds would be critical. Either the situation would de-escalate with the arrival of additional officers, or it could spiral into something even more dangerous with too many amped-up responders. At the 3-minute and 30-second mark, Officer Rivera Keller's partner arrived first. She immediately recognized Washington from department briefings about his visit. "Keller, sir," she called out, approaching cautiously. "That's FBI Director Washington. Stand down." Keller didn't lower his weapon. "How do you know it's really him he could be impersonating?" Rivera moved closer, her own weapon holstered. "Keller, I attended the briefing yesterday. They showed us his photo." "That's him. Lower your weapon." Washington remained perfectly still, understanding that this moment of confusion could still end tragically. Officer Rivera approached the passenger side of Washington's vehicle and looked at the credentials. "These are legitimate FBI credentials, Keller. This is Director Washington." Keller still seemed unwilling to accept reality. Why would the FBI director be driving himself? It doesn't make sense. Washington seized this moment to establish control through calm authority. "Officer Keller," he said clearly, "I am FBI Director Elijah Washington. This stop is being recorded by multiple sources. Please lower your weapon so we can resolve this professionally." Something in Washington's tone finally seemed to register with Keller. His weapon lowered slightly, though it remained pointed in Washington's direction. By the 4-minute mark, the street had transformed into a scene of organized chaos. 2 more patrol cars arrived along with an unmarked vehicle containing agents from the Atlanta FBI field office who had been alerted by Assistant Director Chen. Residents continued recording their numbers, now swelling to over 30 people. Marcus Johnson's live stream had surpassed 100,000 viewers and was being picked up by national news networks. At 4 minutes and 15 seconds, Keller finally lowered his weapon completely, though he still appeared confused and defensive. "I was just following protocol for suspicious vehicles," he muttered. Washington, still bleeding and now feeling the adrenaline crash, maintained his dignified demeanor. "I understand, officer. We'll sort this out properly." 4 minutes and 30 seconds after the gun was drawn, Atlanta Police Chief Diana Reynolds arrived, having been contacted directly by the FBI. Her unmarked SUV screeched to a halt, and she emerged, her expression a mixture of horror and fury. "Officer Keller," she shouted, "holster your weapon immediately." Keller complied finally, seeming to grasp the magnitude of his error. Chief Reynolds approached Washington, profound apology in her eyes. "Director Washington, I cannot express how deeply sorry I am for this incident." Washington nodded acknowledgment, his composure never wavering despite the throbbing pain in his temple. "Chief Reynolds, I'd like to handle this by the book. No special treatment." As the 5-minute mark passed, Washington's security team arrived, having broken numerous traffic laws to reach him. The street now resembled a law enforcement convention, with FBI agents, Atlanta police officers, and even state troopers securing the perimeter as news vans began to arrive. In those 5 minutes, everything had changed. A routine traffic stop had exposed the reality that even the highest-ranking black law enforcement official in the country wasn't immune to racial profiling. Washington knew, as he finally accepted a bandage for his bleeding temple, that this incident would either become a meaningless statistic or a catalyst for real change. The choice would be his to make in the coming hours and days. Can you imagine being in Director Washington's position during those 5 minutes, having a gun pointed at you simply because of the color of your skin? Comment number 1, if you believe Washington's calm response was the right approach, or comment number 2, if you think he should have been more assertive about his rights. What would you have done with a gun pointed at your head and your identity being questioned? Like this video if you admire Washington's incredible composure in the face of such blatant discrimination. Subscribe to hear the shocking aftermath of this incident and how the justice system responded. Now, what do you think happened when the mayor of Atlanta found out about this incident? Did Officer Keller face any consequences? Let's find out in the next part of this extraordinary story. The scene on Peachtree Road transformed from a traffic stop into what looked like a federal emergency response within minutes. Atlanta Police Chief Diana Reynolds took immediate control. Her usual composed demeanor rattled by the gravity of what had transpired. At 58, Reynolds was a decorated 30-year veteran of the force who had broken barriers as the first black woman to lead the department. She approached Washington with profound regret etched across her face. "Director Washington, I cannot begin to express my apologies for this inexcusable incident." Washington, still standing with remarkable dignity despite blood drying on his face, responded evenly. "Chief Reynolds, I appreciate your prompt response. I'd like to follow proper procedure here. No shortcuts because of my position." Reynolds nodded, understanding the significance of his request. This wasn't just about one traffic stop gone wrong. It was about establishing that proper procedures should apply to everyone regardless of status. Meanwhile, Officer Keller stood to the side, the color drained from his face as the reality of his actions began to sink in. His partner, Officer Rivera, was already giving her statement to internal affairs officers who had been summoned to the scene with unprecedented speed. Washington's security team, led by Special Agent Taylor, approached with medical personnel. "Sir, we need to get you to a hospital immediately," Taylor insisted, visibly shaken by the cut on Washington's temple. Washington shook his head. "A first aid kit will suffice for now. I have meetings scheduled that are too important to postpone." Taylor looked like he might argue, but knew better. Washington turned to Chief Reynolds. "I'd like Officer Keller's badge number and a copy of the incident report when it's completed." Reynolds hesitated. "Director Officer Keller will be placed on immediate administrative leave pending investigation. I assure you this matter will be handled with the utmost seriousness." Washington nodded. "I understand, but I still want the official documentation. This incident will be handled through proper channels, not exceptional measures." As the medical technician cleaned and bandaged Washington's wound, news vans from every major network began arriving. The story was spreading like wildfire across social media. Marcus Johnson's live stream had now been viewed by over 500,000 people and was being picked up by national news outlets. Marcus himself had been approached by several reporters but declined immediate interviews, instead continuing his documentation of the scene. Within 30 minutes of the incident, Mayor Calvin Mitchell arrived, his SUV pulling up beside the police vehicles. At 47, Mitchell was in his second term as Atlanta's mayor, a position he'd won on promises of police reform and economic development. His face was grim as he approached Washington. "Director Washington, on behalf of the city of Atlanta, I extend my deepest apologies for this appalling incident." Washington shook the mayor's hand firmly. "Mayor Mitchell, thank you for coming personally. I believe this presents an opportunity for meaningful discussion about the issues I came to Atlanta to address." Mayor Mitchell looked momentarily surprised, then nodded with newfound respect. "Yes, of course, though perhaps we should reschedule after you've had proper medical attention." Washington's phone had been ringing constantly. He finally answered a call from the President of the United States. The conversation was brief, with Washington assuring the President that he was physically fine and requesting that no special federal response be initiated. "Mr. President," he said calmly, "I believe we can handle this through established channels. In fact, I see this as an opportunity to demonstrate the very reforms I've been advocating." After ending the call, Washington turned to his assistant, who had arrived with the security team. "Please inform Reverend Wilson and the other community leaders that our meeting will proceed as scheduled, though perhaps an hour later than planned, and add Officer Keller's incident to the agenda as a case study." Officer Keller was escorted to a police vehicle, not in handcuffs but clearly in disgrace. As he passed Washington, their eyes met briefly. Washington saw not just anger or embarrassment in the officer's expression, but something deeper: fear. Fear of consequences that until this moment Keller had never had to face. Chief Reynolds approached Washington again. "Director, we've arranged for transport to your meeting whenever you're ready. Officer Keller has been taken to headquarters for questioning. I'll be personally overseeing the investigation." Washington nodded. "I appreciate that, Chief. I'd also like to request all body camera and dashboard camera footage be preserved immediately." Reynolds looked uncomfortable. "Sir, about that. Preliminary reports indicate Officer Keller's body camera was not activated during the initial interaction." Washington wasn't surprised. "And the dashboard camera," Reynolds nodded, "that should have captured everything. We'll secure it immediately." By now, Washington's team had established a security perimeter, keeping the growing crowd of onlookers and media at bay. Assistant Director Chen had arranged for additional agents from the Atlanta field office to join Washington's security detail for the remainder of his visit. Medical personnel had cleaned and properly bandaged his head wound, though they continued to recommend a hospital visit for possible concussion symptoms. Washington's phone buzzed with a text from his son, a law student at Howard University. "Dad, you're trending nationwide. Are you okay?" Washington quickly replied that he was fine and would call later. He then addressed the assembled FBI agents and police officers. "I want to thank everyone for their prompt response. I will be proceeding with my scheduled meetings today. This incident, while unfortunate, illustrates exactly why those meetings are necessary." As Washington prepared to leave for his delayed meeting with community leaders, he noticed Marcus Johnson still filming from across the street. Making a decision, Washington walked over to him, causing a flurry of activity as security scrambled to follow. Mr. Johnson, Washington said, having heard his name during the live stream, thank you for documenting what happened here today. Marcus lowered his phone, visibly moved by the acknowledgement. Director Washington, I just did what needed to be done. Are you really okay? Washington nodded. I am, and I believe your video will help ensure accountability. Marcus hesitated, then asked, will anything actually change, though, or will this just be another incident that gets swept under the rug because the system protects its own? Washington looked directly into Marcus's camera, aware that hundreds of thousands were still watching. Not this time, Mr. Johnson. I give you my word on that. As Washington was escorted to his vehicle, now driven by an FBI agent rather than himself, reporters shouted questions. He paused briefly to make one statement. What happened today was unfortunate, but not uncommon. The difference is that most citizens who experience such treatment don't have my resources or position. That disparity is precisely what I came to Atlanta to address and what I intend to change. Washington then departed for Ebenezer Baptist Church, where Reverend Wilson and other civil rights leaders were waiting. The meeting, originally scheduled to last 2 hours, extended to nearly 4, as Washington shared his personal experience from that morning and integrated it into his reform proposals. Meanwhile, at Atlanta Police Headquarters, Officer Keller sat in an interview room facing questions from internal affairs investigators. His police union representative had already arrived, advising him to say nothing until they had reviewed the evidence. Chief Reynolds watched through the one-way glass, her expression unreadable. On her desk, her phone displayed dozens of missed calls from city officials, state representatives, and the Department of Justice. The incident had exploded beyond a local police matter into a national referendum on race and policing in America. And at the center of it all was FBI Director Elijah Washington, who had transformed from victim to architect of change in the span of a single morning. As the day progressed, the video of the incident spread to millions of viewers. News channels played it on continuous loops. Social media platforms were flooded with reactions, the vast majority expressing outrage at Officer Keller's actions and admiration for Washington's composure. What had begun as a routine traffic stop was rapidly becoming a defining moment in American law enforcement history, one that would force the nation to confront uncomfortable truths about who gets stopped, who gets respected, and who gets the benefit of the doubt when interacting with police. By sunset on that first day, the video of FBI Director Elijah Washington staring down the barrel of Officer Keller's gun had been viewed over 30 million times across various platforms. Every major news network had interrupted regular programming to cover the story with panels of experts analyzing every second of the encounter. The hashtags Director Washington and Driving While Black were trending worldwide. Washington himself had maintained his schedule despite the morning's trauma meeting with civil rights leaders, community organizers, and finally a select group of reform-minded police officers from across Georgia. At 6 p.m., he stood before a forest of microphones outside Ebenezer Baptist Church, the historic site where Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. once preached. Media from across the globe had assembled, creating the largest press gathering Atlanta had seen in decades. Washington, still bearing the bandage on his temple, spoke with measured precision. Today, I experienced firsthand what too many Americans face regularly. I was profiled, detained, assaulted, and had a weapon pointed at me during a routine traffic stop. The officer involved ignored my identification, dismissed my explanation, and escalated the situation unnecessarily. He paused, letting the words sink in. I share this not to seek special treatment or sympathy, but to highlight a simple truth. If this happens to me wearing this suit with this title, what happens to everyday black Americans? That sentence electrified the nation. Within hours, it appeared on T-shirts, social media graphics, and protest signs. It became the rallying cry for a new wave of demands for police accountability. In Washington, D.C., the president addressed the nation from the Oval Office, calling the incident a disturbing reminder of the work still needed to ensure equal justice under law. And he announced the formation of a special task force to investigate patterns of racial profiling in law enforcement agencies receiving federal funding. The Attorney General, speaking separately, revealed that the Department of Justice had already opened a civil rights investigation into the Atlanta Police Department based on a confidential report that had flagged troubling patterns weeks before Washington's incident. Police organizations across the country scrambled to respond. Some issued statements supporting Washington and condemning Officer Keller's actions. Others took a more defensive stance, cautioning against rushing to judgment based on partial video evidence. The National Association of Black Law Enforcement Officers released a powerful statement describing the incident as confirmation of what we have always known: no Black American, regardless of status, is immune from racial profiling. Investigative journalists began digging into Officer Keller's history. By midnight, several news outlets had uncovered his 17 previous excessive force complaints, 12 involving Black citizens. They also discovered that 3 of those complaints had been settled by the city for substantial sums, with confidentiality agreements preventing the victims from discussing the cases publicly. One particularly troubling case involved a Black college student who had suffered a broken arm during a traffic stop for a burned-out tail light. Washington's family made their first public appearance that evening. His wife, Dr. Catherine Washington, a prominent neurologist, stood with their son Miles and daughter Zora outside their Georgetown home. Dr. Washington spoke briefly but powerfully. Today, my husband experienced what Black families across America fear every day. When our son got his driver's license, Elijah spent hours teaching him how to survive a traffic stop. No parent should have to have that conversation with their child. The next morning, Washington attended his scheduled meeting with a coalition of Atlanta police officers who supported reform efforts. Despite his staff's concerns about security, he insisted on keeping the appointment. These officers are part of the solution, he told his team. Canceling would send exactly the wrong message. The meeting, originally planned as a closed-door session, was open to select media at Washington's request. Inside, he listened as Black officers described their own experiences with racism, both from the public and within their departments. Officer Tanya Jackson, a 15-year veteran, spoke through tears. I joined to make a difference, but some days I feel caught between 2 worlds that both reject me for different reasons. Washington nodded in understanding. That's why reform must come from both within and without. We need your voices and experiences to guide this process. On Capitol Hill, congressional leaders from both parties issued statements condemning the incident. The Senate Judiciary Committee announced emergency hearings on racial profiling in law enforcement. The House Oversight Committee requested that Washington testify once he returned to Washington, D.C. The incident had achieved something rare in modern American politics: bipartisan concern, albeit with different proposed solutions. Conservative lawmakers generally focused on better training and individual accountability, while progressive representatives called for structural reforms and redirecting portions of police funding to social services. Back in Atlanta, Officer Keller remained suspended, with pay a standard procedure that itself became a target of criticism. The police union had arranged legal representation for him, but unusually issued a statement distancing itself from his actions. While we believe in due process for all officers, the available evidence suggests Officer Keller failed to follow departmental procedures in his interaction with Director Washington. This tepid criticism itself became news, as police unions rarely publicly questioned an officer's conduct before an official investigation concluded. Chief Reynolds announced that the department would release dashboard camera footage within 48 hours, an unusually swift timeline that reflected the immense public pressure. She also revealed that Officer Keller's body camera had been turned off during the initial interaction, but was activated after he called for backup. The gap in body camera footage intensified suspicions about Keller's conduct and intentions. Washington conducted a series of interviews with major networks, maintaining his composed, measured tone throughout. When pressed about what should happen to Officer Keller, he consistently responded, "I believe in due process. What I want is for the system to work fairly and transparently, the same way it should work for any citizen in my position." This diplomatic answer frustrated some activists who wanted Washington to call for Keller's immediate firing and prosecution. Others admired his restraint and commitment to procedural justice. On the third day after the incident, Washington attended his originally scheduled community meeting at a South Atlanta community center. The audience had swelled from the planned 100 attendees to over 1,000, requiring the event to be moved to a local high school gymnasium. Community members shared stories of their own negative interactions with police, many breaking down in tears as they finally felt their experiences were being validated at the highest levels. Washington listened intently to each speaker, taking notes and occasionally asking clarifying questions. When it was his turn to speak, he connected his recent experience to the broader patterns described by community members. "What happened to me was not exceptional. What's exceptional is that people paid attention because of who I am. Real reform means creating a system where everyone's experience matters equally." That evening, Washington received a call from the family of Jamal Richardson, a black teenager who had been killed by police during a traffic stop 2 years earlier. The case had received little national attention at the time. Washington arranged to meet with them privately the following morning, away from media cameras. During that emotional meeting, he promised to have the FBI review the case file. "Your son's life mattered," so he told Richardson's mother, "and his death should matter to all of us." As the week progressed, the national conversation continued to intensify. Conservative commentator William Barrett, usually critical of police reform efforts, surprised his audience by saying, "If the FBI director can be treated this way because of his race, we have a problem we can no longer ignore." Liberal analyst Sophia Martinez responded on her own show, "We've been saying this for decades. The question is, will this incident finally be enough to create real change?" Washington's final day in Atlanta included a private meeting with a group of police officers who had reached out through secure channels to report racism within the department. These whistleblowers described a culture where racist comments were commonplace, and officers who reported misconduct faced retaliation. Washington arranged for them to speak with trusted FBI agents who could document their experiences while protecting their identities. Before leaving Atlanta, Washington held one final press conference. Reporters immediately asked whether his treatment would have been different if he weren't the FBI director. Washington's response was forthright. "We all know the answer to that question. Without my position, this incident would likely be just another complaint dismissed or settled quietly. That disparity is precisely what must change." As Washington boarded his flight back to Washington, D.C., he was unaware that his driver's side window had captured the entire incident with perfect clarity, including Officer Keller's comments before activating his body camera. That footage, about to be released to the public, would take an already volatile situation and turn it into an unstoppable demand for change that would reshape American policing forever. The FBI's Atlanta field office transformed into Command Central for what became known as the Washington investigation. Director Washington, true to his principles, insisted that standard protocols be followed despite his personal involvement. "I want this investigation conducted by the book," he instructed Assistant Director Chen. "No special procedures because the victim happens to be me." Chen nodded, though privately she had already authorized extraordinary resources for the case. A specialized team of the Bureau's most experienced civil rights investigators was assembled, led by Special Agent Vanessa Rodriguez, a 20-year veteran with an impeccable record investigating police misconduct cases. Rodriguez began by obtaining every piece of available evidence: Marcus Johnson's live stream footage from neighborhood security cameras, police, dashboard cameras and Officer Keller's body camera footage after it was activated. The team also collected witness statements from the 27 residents who had observed parts of the incident. What emerged was a comprehensive picture far more disturbing than even the viral videos had shown. The dashboard camera had captured Officer Keller muttering, "Let's see what this guy is doing in this neighborhood," before even activating his lights. This single statement would become crucial evidence of potential bias in the initial stop. Rodriguez's team didn't stop with the incident itself. They began examining Officer Keller's entire history with the Atlanta Police Department. The 17 excessive force complaints were just the beginning. The FBI discovered that Keller had conducted 1,432 traffic stops during the previous 3 years. Of those, nearly 78% involved black drivers, despite Buckhead being only 22% black. The statistical improbability of this disparity without bias was astronomical. Meanwhile, Washington returned to his office in Washington, D.C., the cut on his temple still visible though healing. Despite his staff's concerns about his schedule, he worked even longer hours than usual, personally reviewing evidence as it came in. "Sir, you should be resting," his chief of staff protested. Washington shook his head. "This isn't about me anymore. It's about making sure we get this right." 5 days after the incident, Officer Rivera Keller's partner contacted the FBI voluntarily. Her testimony proved devastating. Officer Keller frequently made comments about black drivers being out of place in certain neighborhoods, she stated in her sworn affidavit. He would specifically look for reasons to pull over black drivers in affluent areas. When asked why she hadn't reported this behavior previously, Rivera's answer was telling, "Officers who report other officers get blacklisted. No one would back them up on dangerous calls. It's an unwritten rule." Her testimony opened the floodgates. 3 other officers from Keller's precinct came forward with similar accounts. One provided text messages where Keller had used racial slurs to describe black citizens he had encountered on patrol. The investigation expanded beyond Keller himself to examine the culture and practices of his precinct. The FBI discovered a disturbing pattern. Complaints about racial profiling were routinely classified as unfounded without proper investigation. Officers with multiple complaints continued to patrol without additional supervision or training. Washington, reviewing these findings late one night, felt a complex mixture of emotions. Vindication that the evidence supported what black communities had been saying for decades, but also deep disappointment in the system he had dedicated his life to improving. On day 7, the investigation made a breakthrough that changed everything. Special Agent Rodriguez discovered that 3 years earlier, Keller had been involved in a traffic stop where a black motorist named Marcus Wilson died under questionable circumstances. The official report stated that Wilson had reached for Keller's weapon, necessitating the use of deadly force. No charges had been filed, and Keller had been cleared by an internal investigation. Rodriguez, following her instincts, tracked down a witness from that incident who had never been interviewed by the original investigators. The witness, a delivery driver who had been parked across the street, contradicted Keller's account entirely. "The man had his hands up the whole time," the witness stated. "He never reached for anything." When asked why he hadn't come forward at the time, and the witness explained, "I did. I called the department 3 times. Nobody ever called me back." Washington, upon learning of this development, personally contacted Marcus Wilson's family. Their 3-year fight for justice had gone nowhere until this moment. Washington promised them a complete reinvestigation of their son's death. "Your son matters, says," he told Wilson's mother, "and the truth about what happened to him matters." By the second week, the FBI had compiled enough evidence to present to the Department of Justice for potential federal civil rights charges. The evidence package included not just the details of Washington's incident, but the broader pattern of racial profiling and potential cover-ups within the precinct. Washington insisted on recusing himself from the charging decision due to his role as victim, turning that authority over to the Deputy Attorney General. As the investigation continued, Washington maintained a punishing schedule, dividing his time between his regular duties as FBI director and meetings with police reform advocates, community leaders, and families affected by police misconduct. The strain began to show physically. The cut on his temple healed, but dark circles formed under his eyes from lack of sleep. His doctor warned him about the potential health consequences of his pace, but Washington was driven by a sense of purpose that transcended personal comfort. "This moment won't come again," he told his concerned wife. "We have to seize it while the attention is focused." 3 weeks after the incident, the investigation delivered its most shocking finding yet. Forensic analysis of precinct computers revealed that complaints about Officer Keller and several other officers had been deliberately misclassified and buried through a systematic process involving multiple levels of command. The digital trail led directly to former police chief Robert Thornton, who had retired the previous year with full honors. Current Chief Reynolds was horrified by the discovery. "I inherited a system I believed was functioning properly," she told Washington during an emergency meeting. "I had no idea this was happening." Washington believed her, but the damage was done. Public trust in the department's oversight mechanisms had been shattered. At the 1-month mark, Washington testified before Congress about the incident and the subsequent investigation. His testimony was carried live on every major network. When asked by Senator Malcolm Barnes whether he believed racial bias was pervasive in American policing, Washington gave a nuanced response that would be quoted extensively. Is every officer biased? Are there dedicated, honorable officers who serve their communities with distinction? Absolutely. But does the system as currently structured enable biased individuals to act on that bias with minimal consequences? The evidence suggests yes, and that must change. The investigation continued to expand, revealing connections between Keller and Judge William Brennan, who had dismissed several lawsuits against officers from Keller's precinct. Financial records showed that Brennan's son had received an unexplained cash payment of $50,000 the day after dismissing one particularly compelling case. The FBI opened a separate investigation into possible judicial corruption. Washington, despite recusing himself from decisions directly involving his case, remained deeply involved in the broader corruption investigation. "This is exactly why I joined the Bureau Tio," he told Assistant Director Chen, "to ensure that justice is applied equally regardless of position or power." As the second month began, Washington's security team discovered a concerning development. A fringe extremist group had posted threats against Washington online, calling him a race traitor for investigating fellow law enforcement officers. The threats were deemed credible enough that his security detail was doubled. Washington refused to be intimidated, maintaining his public appearances and declining to comment on the threats when asked by reporters. The investigation reached its climax when Special Agent Rodriguez uncovered a series of encrypted messages between Keller and 6 other officers discussing ways to target black drivers without triggering department oversight. The messages included explicit racial slurs and jokes about planting evidence. This discovery transformed what had begun as an investigation into one officer's misconduct into a case of potential criminal conspiracy involving multiple officers. The evidence was overwhelming, but Washington knew that building an airtight case would be essential to overcome the skepticism and resistance that would inevitably follow. Can you imagine discovering this level of corruption in a system you've dedicated your life to improving? Comment number 1. If you believe Washington was right to pursue this investigation so thoroughly despite personal risks, or comment number 2, if you think he should have delegated more to protect his health and safety. Would you have the courage to continue seeking justice when powerful people want you to stop? Like this video. If you admire Washington's dedication to exposing the truth, and subscribe to see how this investigation leads to the breaking point. Will the entire corrupt system be exposed, or will powerful forces manage to cover up their involvement? Let's find out in the next part of this incredible story of courage and determination. The tide of public opinion strongly favored Director Washington, but powerful forces began working behind the scenes to control the narrative and limit the investigation's scope. The National Police Union, while initially distancing itself from Officer Keller, shifted tactics as the investigation expanded to implicate more officers and supervisors. Union President Michael Rawlings held a press conference criticizing what he called a rush to judgment and witch hunt atmosphere. While we do not condone any officer who violates proper procedure, Rawlings stated, we are concerned about due process being sacrificed on the altar of political expediency. His carefully worded statement avoided directly defending Keller while attempting to slow the momentum of the investigation. Washington watched the press conference from his office, unsurprised but disappointed. He had expected resistance once the investigation moved beyond a single bad apple narrative to expose systemic issues. More concerning was the sudden pressure from unexpected quarters. Senator James Whitfield, who had initially expressed outrage over Washington's treatment, called him directly. Elijah, I'm concerned about the breadth of this investigation, sir, the senator said. There's talk that it's becoming a fishing expedition rather than focusing on the specific incident. Washington's response was measured but firm. Senator, we're following the evidence where it leads us. That's how proper investigations work. Whitfield's tone cooled. Just be careful about overreach. You have a lot of support now, but that can change quickly. After hanging up, Washington received a report that several wealthy donors had met with the mayor of Atlanta, urging him to publicly question whether the federal investigation was interfering with local authority. The mayor, to his credit, had refused, but the pressure was building. Meanwhile, certain media outlets began subtle attempts to undermine Washington. Conservative commentator Victor Reynolds questioned why Washington had been driving himself in the first place. Isn't it standard protocol for the FBI director to have a security detail? Was Director Washington deliberately creating a situation by driving alone through that neighborhood? This baseless insinuation was quickly amplified across social media platforms, with bot accounts pushing the narrative that Washington had somehow engineered the confrontation. Marcus Johnson, whose live stream had been instrumental in documenting the incident, began receiving death threats. Anonymous callers threatened his family, and his car was vandalized with racial slurs. The FBI immediately assigned agents to protect him, but the intimidation took its toll. I don't regret what I did, Johnson told Washington during a private meeting, but I never expected this level of blowback. Washington's own family faced similar harassment. His son Miles was followed by unknown individuals on his university campus. His wife Catherine received threatening calls at her medical practice. Their home address was posted on extremist forums with calls for patriots to pay them a visit. Washington's security team intercepted a suspicious package addressed to his home that contained a dead rat. The message was clear: those who exposed police misconduct were considered rats, and this was their fate. Internal resistance emerged as well. Several veteran FBI agents from the old guard quietly questioned whether Washington was pushing too hard against fellow law enforcement officers. These concerns never reached Washington directly, but were reported to Assistant Director Chen, who monitored the situation carefully. There's some grumbling in the ranks, she informed Washington. Nothing serious yet, but worth knowing about. Washington nodded. Expected. Change never comes without resistance. And the most sophisticated opposition came from Judge William Brennan, whose connections to Officer Keller had been uncovered by the investigation. Rather than directly attacking Washington, Brennan used his extensive network within the judicial system to create procedural obstacles. Search warrants were suddenly scrutinized with unusual rigor. Evidence collection faced administrative delays. Case documentation was questioned on technical grounds. Washington recognized the strategy death by 1,000 paper cuts designed to slow the investigation until public attention moved elsewhere. The breaking point came when Washington discovered that critical evidence had gone missing from the Atlanta Police Department's secure storage. The dashboard camera footage from Officer Keller's previous fatal shooting of Marcus Wilson could no longer be located. The official explanation was administrative error, but Washington knew better. Someone with significant authority had deliberately removed evidence that could have proven Keller's previous misconduct. That evening, Washington received an unexpected call from the president. "Elijah, I'm hearing concerns from various quarters about the scope of your investigation," the president began carefully. "There's a feeling that it might be more productive to focus on forward-looking reforms rather than past misconduct." Washington recognized the political calculation behind the suggestion. The president was feeling pressure from police unions, an important constituency in an election year. "Mr. President," Washington replied, "accountability and reform are not separate issues. We cannot build a just system on a foundation of unaddressed injustice." The call ended cordially, but with a palpable tension. Later that night, Washington was approached with what appeared to be a peace offering. The Attorney General suggested that Washington consider accepting a prestigious judicial appointment to the Court of Appeals. "You've had an exemplary career at the Bureau," the Attorney General said. "This would be a fitting capstone and a position where you could continue to influence justice reform from the bench." Washington immediately recognized the offer for what it was, a velvet-lined exit door designed to remove him from the investigation while appearing to honor his service. "I appreciate the consideration," Washington responded, "but I believe my work at the Bureau remains unfinished." The next morning, Keller's attorney, prominent defense lawyer James Harrington, launched an aggressive media campaign. "Director Washington has a clear conflict of interest," Harrington claimed on national television. "He's using federal resources to pursue a personal vendetta against my client." The accusation was absurd given Washington's recusal from decisions directly involving his case, but it provided a convenient talking point for those seeking to undermine the investigation. Social media campaigns suddenly emerged questioning Washington's objectivity. Sophisticated disinformation specialists created false narratives, including fabricated witnesses claiming Washington had been driving erratically before being stopped. These tactics were familiar to Washington from his counterintelligence work. They bore the hallmarks of coordinated attempts to manipulate public opinion. Perhaps most painful was the division within protest movements themselves. Some activists criticized Washington as part of the establishment and questioned his commitment to real change. "He's just trying to save the system rather than transform it," claimed one influential organizer. Others defended Washington as working within the system to create meaningful reform. The debate created fractures in what had initially been a unified response to the incident. Through it all, Washington maintained his focus and dignity. He refused to engage in public arguments with critics, instead letting the investigation speak for itself. When evidence of tampering with witnesses emerged, Washington authorized additional resources to protect those who had come forward. When threats against his family intensified, he ensured their security while refusing to be intimidated into silence. In a pivotal moment, Washington was invited to address a national law enforcement conference. Many advised him to decline, warning that he would face a hostile audience. Instead, Washington accepted walking into a room filled with officers and administrators, many of whom viewed his investigation as an attack on their profession. His speech was direct but respectful. "I stand before you not as an adversary but as a colleague who believes deeply in the nobility of what law enforcement should be. What happened to me was wrong, not because of who I am, but because it would be wrong no matter who experiences it." Justice cannot be negotiated or compromised. It must be pursued without fear or favor, regardless of who stands to lose or gain. The room remained tense, but Washington's unwavering commitment to principle earned grudging respect even from some critics. As resistance mounted from all directions, Washington received news that would dramatically escalate the confrontation. An anonymous whistleblower had come forward with video evidence showing Keller's precinct captain explicitly instructing officers on how to conduct racially biased stops while avoiding departmental scrutiny. The footage recorded secretly during a roll call meeting included the captain saying, "Remember, it's not about race on paper. Find a technical violation, use that as your reason, and you're covered." This smoking gun transformed the investigation from one officer's misconduct into evidence of institutionalized discrimination. Washington knew that releasing this evidence would trigger the fiercest resistance yet from those with power to lose. The question was no longer if there would be a breaking point, but when it would come, and whether Washington had the strength to withstand the storm that would follow. The morning began with news that shook Washington to his core. Assistant Director Chen arrived at his office, unannounced, her expression grave. "Sir, I've just been informed that the U.S. Attorney's Office has reached a preliminary plea agreement with Officer Keller." Washington set down his coffee cup. "What are the terms?" Chen's jaw tightened. 6 months probation, no jail time, and he keeps his pension in exchange for his resignation from the force. The office fell silent as Washington processed this information. After all the evidence they had uncovered, after the dashboard footage, the witness testimonies, the pattern of racist comments, and problematic stops, the justice system was prepared to let Keller walk away virtually unscathed. "Who authorized this?" Washington finally asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Acting U.S. Attorney Giles made the decision yesterday afternoon," Chen replied. "He claims it's based on the likelihood of conviction at trial, but our sources say there was significant pressure from above." Washington stood and walked to the window looking out over the Washington, D.C. skyline. This was the breaking point he had feared, but anticipated. The system was closing ranks, protecting its own. The message was clear even with the FBI director as the victim, even with irrefutable evidence and national attention, the blue wall would prevail. "Get me a meeting with the Attorney General, Yeet," Washington said, "today." The meeting with Attorney General Crawford was tense from the outset. "Elijah, I understand you're upset about the plea agreement," Crawford began, "but prosecutorial discretion is outside your jurisdiction as FBI director." Washington leaned forward. "With respect, sir, this isn't about jurisdiction. It's about justice. The evidence against Keller would support multiple serious charges. A token probation sentence sends a devastating message to every Black American who has experienced police misconduct." Crawford shifted uncomfortably. "The political reality is complicated. Police unions across the country are watching this case closely. We have to consider the broader implications for law enforcement cooperation with federal agencies." Washington's response was measured but forceful. "Sir, I've dedicated my life to the principle that justice should be blind to political considerations. If we cannot uphold that principle in a case with this much evidence and this much visibility, then the system is more broken than I believed." The meeting ended with no resolution, but Washington had made his position clear. Back at the FBI, he gathered his most trusted team members. "I need options," he told them, "legal, procedural, and public." The team worked through the night, identifying potential strategies. By morning, Washington had made his decision. At a hastily arranged press conference, Washington made an announcement that sent shockwaves through Washington, D.C. "After careful consideration, I must inform the American people that I cannot in good conscience continue as FBI director if the Justice Department accepts the proposed plea agreement with Officer Keller. This is not about my personal experience as a victim. It is about upholding the principle that no one is above the law and no one should be beneath its protection." The resignation threat was unprecedented from an FBI director. The White House immediately called requesting an urgent meeting with the president. Meanwhile, Washington's statement catalyzed public response. Within hours, a rally supporting Washington drew thousands to the National Mall. Civil rights organizations mobilized their members nationwide. The hashtag #StandWithWashington began trending globally. Marcus Johnson, still under FBI protection due to threats, organized an online coalition of individuals who had witnessed or experienced police misconduct. Their testimonies flooded social media, creating a powerful counter-narrative to those defending Keller. The president's meeting with Washington was brief but consequential. "You've put me in an impossible position, Elijah," the president said, "but I respect your principles." "What exactly do you want?" Washington was direct. "I want the FBI to take full control of this investigation under federal civil rights statutes. I want the plea deal withdrawn, and I want a special prosecutor appointed from outside the Department of Justice to avoid any appearance of political influence." The president weighed these demands, aware of the political costs either way. Finally, he nodded. "You'll have what you asked for, but Elijah, there will be consequences. Powerful people don't forget being challenged." Washington nodded. "I'm well aware, Mr. President." With the FBI now fully in charge, Washington made a strategic decision that would prove decisive. Though he had recused himself from decisions about his own case, he remained director of the entire bureau. He authorized Special Agent Rodriguez to pursue the corruption investigation to its fullest extent, regardless of who might be implicated. Within days, the investigation produced dramatic results. The whistleblower's video of the precinct captain instructing officers on biased policing was authenticated and expanded to include recordings from multiple roll calls. Text messages between Keller and other officers revealed coordination of racially targeted enforcement. Most significantly, financial records showed suspicious payments from a local business owner to Keller and 3 superior officers in exchange for heightened patrols targeting unwanted elements in the business district, a thinly veiled reference to black youth. Washington's health began to suffer from the relentless pace and stress. During a late-night strategy session, he experienced chest pains severe enough that his staff insisted on a medical examination. The diagnosis was exhaustion and stress-induced hypertension. The doctor prescribed rest and medication advice Washington acknowledged but largely ignored. "There will be time to rest when this is finished," he told his concerned wife. The investigation's expansion faced its greatest challenge when a leaked audio recording emerged of Keller speaking with his attorney. In the recording, Keller explicitly admitted the racial motivation for stopping Washington. "Yeah, I stopped him because he was black and Buckhead, but you can't say that in court." The recording's provenance was questionable, potentially obtained illegally, raising complex legal questions about its admissibility. Washington faced a moral dilemma: use potentially tainted evidence to secure justice, or adhere strictly to procedural rules that might allow guilty parties to escape accountability. After intense deliberation with legal experts, Washington made his decision. The FBI would not use the leaked recording in court, but would continue to build a case based on properly obtained evidence. "We will not compromise our integrity even in pursuit of justice," he told his team. "We have enough legitimate evidence to proceed." This principled stance earned Washington respect, even from some previous critics who recognized he was holding himself to the same standards he demanded of others. The Department of Justice, now under intense scrutiny, filed federal civil rights charges against Keller, 2 supervising officers, and the precinct captain. The charges were comprehensive, encompassing not only Washington's incident, but the pattern of discriminatory policing and the alleged cover-up of Marcus Wilson's death 3 years earlier. Keller's attorney, recognizing the strengthened case against his client, approached prosecutors about a potential cooperation agreement. Keller would provide testimony against higher-ranking officers in exchange for consideration during sentencing. As other officers recognized the shifting tide, similar offers followed. The blue wall of silence began to crumble as self-preservation instincts took over. Chief Reynolds, though not implicated in criminal wrongdoing, faced the devastating revelation that she had failed to recognize and address the corruption within her department. In a tearful press conference, she announced her resignation, acknowledging that new leadership is needed to rebuild trust. Washington respected her decision, but felt no satisfaction in her downfall. She had been an ally in many ways, simply overwhelmed by a system of corruption that predated her tenure. The investigation reached its zenith when evidence directly connected former Police Chief Thornton to the deliberate burial of complaints against Keller and other officers. Financial records revealed unexplained deposits to offshore accounts, coinciding with major misconduct settlements being suppressed. Washington now faced a critical strategic decision. The evidence was substantial, but complex. A trial would be lengthy, expensive, and would subject victims to cross-examination and public scrutiny. The defense would employ every tactic to discredit witnesses and create reasonable doubt. There was no guarantee of convictions, despite the strength of the evidence. Alternatively, Washington could use the leverage of overwhelming evidence to force comprehensive reforms through consent decrees and administrative actions. This approach would prioritize systemic change over individual punishment. After consulting with victims' families, including Marcus Wilson's parents, Washington chose a bold third option. He would pursue both tracks simultaneously: criminal prosecution of the most serious offenders and systemic reform through administrative and civil remedies. In a joint press conference with civil rights leaders, Washington laid out the evidence and his dual approach. Justice requires both accountability for past wrongs and structural changes to prevent future injustice, he stated. We will pursue both with equal vigor. The press conference concluded with Washington's most powerful statement yet delivered, with the quiet authority that had become his trademark: "To those who believe they are above the law, your time of reckoning has come. To those who have suffered in silence, your voices will now be heard. And to those who stand in the way of justice, the truth is coming, and no power on earth can stop it." As Washington left the podium, he knew he had just challenged some of the most powerful institutions in America. The resistance he had faced so far would pale in comparison to what would come next. But for the first time since that morning on Peachtree Road, he felt something that had been missing: the certainty that, regardless of personal cost, he was doing exactly what he had sworn an oath to do. The grand jury proceedings lasted 3 weeks longer than usual for police misconduct cases. 27 witnesses testified, including officers who had broken ranks to expose the culture of discrimination within the Atlanta Police Department. Washington himself testified for nearly 6 hours, describing not only his personal experience, but placing it in the context of systemic issues he had observed throughout his law enforcement career. When the grand jury emerged, the indictments were more extensive than anyone had anticipated. Officer Richard Keller faced 8 felony counts, including civil rights violations, assault on a federal officer, filing false reports, and conspiracy charges related to the Marcus Wilson case. 3 supervising officers were indicted for conspiracy and obstruction of justice. Most significantly, former Police Chief Robert Thornton was charged with racketeering under federal RICO statutes for orchestrating the systematic suppression of misconduct complaints. News of the indictments dominated headlines nationwide. Law enforcement agencies watched with a mixture of concern and, in progressive departments, cautious optimism that accountability might finally extend beyond token sacrifices of individual officers to address command-level responsibility. Washington held no press conference following the indictments, allowing the legal process to proceed without commentary that might influence potential jurors. Behind the scenes, however, he worked tirelessly on the second part of his strategy: comprehensive reform. Working with a coalition of police chiefs committed to change, civil rights attorneys, and community organizations, Washington drafted what would become known as the Accountability and Community Trust (ACT) framework. The framework included mandatory body cameras with automatic activation during stops, civilian review boards with subpoena power, revised use of force protocols, and transparent disciplinary records for officers. Most controversially, it established a national database for tracking police misconduct across jurisdictions, preventing officers fired for cause from simply moving to another department. Officer Keller's trial became the most closely watched police misconduct case in decades. Despite efforts to move the proceedings to a different venue, the judge ruled that the case would be tried in Atlanta, where the incidents occurred. Jury selection took nearly 2 weeks as attorneys from both sides sought to identify jurors who could evaluate the evidence fairly, despite the enormous publicity surrounding the case. Washington testified early in the proceedings, spending a full day on the witness stand. He described the traffic stop in precise detail, neither embellishing nor downplaying what had occurred. When asked about his emotions during the incident, he responded with characteristic thoughtfulness, "I experienced fear, certainly, but also a profound sadness knowing that what was happening to me happens to countless citizens who don't have my resource or position to ensure accountability." The defense strategy focused on portraying Keller as a scapegoat for systemic issues beyond his control. His attorney argued that he had been trained and supervised by the very commanders now disavowing him. Officer Keller followed the unwritten rules his superiors established, the defense attorney claimed. Now they've thrown him under the bus to save themselves. This approach backfired when prosecutors presented evidence that Keller had gone beyond even the problematic practices of his precinct, establishing a pattern of targeting black drivers that exceeded departmental norms. The trial's most powerful moment came from an unexpected witness. An elderly white woman who lived across from where Washington had been stopped approached prosecutors after seeing news coverage of the trial. Margaret Sullivan, 76, had witnessed the entire incident from her front porch. Her testimony was devastating in its simplicity. "That officer was angry from the moment he approached the car," she stated. "The gentleman had his hands visible the entire time and spoke calmly. There was no reason for what happened. None at all." After 2 weeks of testimony, the case went to the jury. Deliberations lasted just 2 hours before they returned with guilty verdicts on all counts. The courtroom remained silent as the verdicts were read, the weight of the moment transcending usual reactions. Keller showed no emotion as he was taken into custody to await sentencing. The sentencing hearing 3 weeks later provided the most surprising moment of the entire case. Judge Camilla Jackson, a black woman who had served on the federal bench for 15 years, delivered a statement that would be quoted in law schools for generations. "Mr. Keller, your actions reflect not just individual bias, but the failure of a system that enabled and protected that bias. Your sentence must reflect both personal accountability and the need for institutional change. The harm you caused extends beyond Director Washington to every citizen whose trust in law enforcement was damaged by your actions." She sentenced Keller to 12 years in federal prison, significantly more than prosecutors had recommended. The subsequent trials of the supervising officers and former Chief Thornton resulted in additional convictions, sending a clear message that accountability extended up the chain of command. Meanwhile, Washington's reform efforts gained unexpected momentum. The Washington Act, as it became known in congressional circles, received bipartisan support after modifications addressing concerns from both progressive and conservative lawmakers. The act established federal standards for police accountability, created funding mechanisms for reform initiatives, and authorized the National Misconduct Database Washington had championed. President Wilson signed the act into law 6 months after Washington's traffic stop, with the FBI director standing beside him in the Rose Garden. Washington declined the Presidential Medal of Freedom offered in recognition of his courage and leadership. Instead, he requested that the funds allocated for the traditional White House ceremony be directed to a newly established Victims' Compensation Fund for those who had suffered from police misconduct. The fund was named in honor of Marcus Wilson, bringing a measure of peace to his family 3 years after his death. Marcus Johnson, whose live stream had been instrumental in bringing Washington's case to public attention, was appointed to the Civilian Oversight Board created to monitor implementation of reforms in Atlanta. His technical expertise and community connections made him an ideal bridge between law enforcement and citizens. 1 year after the traffic stop, Washington returned to the exact spot on Peachtree Road where Keller had pulled him over. A small memorial had been established there, not for Washington, but for all victims of biased policing. Washington stood silently reflecting on the changes of the past year and the work still to be done. The statistical impacts were already becoming visible. Racially disparate traffic stops had decreased by 42% in departments implementing the ACT framework. Citizen complaints were being investigated more thoroughly, and officer recruitment had actually increased in departments emphasizing the guardian rather than warrior model of policing. 6 months into his prison sentence, Keller requested a meeting with Washington. After careful consideration, Washington agreed. The conversation, conducted without attorneys present at Keller's request, remained private for years afterward. Only in Washington's memoirs published after his retirement did he reveal what transpired. Keller had undergone a transformation that I found both surprising and moving, Washington wrote. He spoke of confronting his biases during months of reflection, of understanding for the first time the harm he had caused countless citizens whose only crime was driving while black. His apology seemed genuine, as did his commitment to speak to police cadets about his journey if ever given the opportunity. Washington did not oppose Keller's later request for admission to a rehabilitation program that would allow him to speak to police trainees about bias and accountability. Redemption must be possible in any just system, Washington told reporters when asked about his position, but accountability must come first. The most unexpected revelation emerged 5 years after the incident. In a wide-ranging interview upon his retirement from the FBI, Washington acknowledged what some had long suspected: his decision to drive himself in Atlanta had been a deliberate choice based on data analysis. "We had statistical evidence of problematic policing patterns in specific Atlanta neighborhoods," Washington explained. "While I never anticipated the extreme nature of what occurred, I did recognize that a black man driving an unmarked vehicle in certain areas faced a high probability of being stopped regardless of driving behavior." This calculated risk had been part of Washington's strategy to experience firsthand what many citizens endured regularly. The admission generated controversy, with some accusing Washington of engineering a confrontation. Others praised his willingness to put himself at risk to expose systemic problems that might otherwise have remained hidden behind statistics and anonymous complaints. In his final act as FBI director, Washington established a mandatory training program for all federal law enforcement officers. The curriculum included not just bias recognition and de-escalation techniques, but also first-person accounts from citizens who had experienced profiling and misconduct. Washington's own experience became a case study examined from multiple perspectives to help officers understand both the legal and human dimensions of their actions. As Washington cleaned out his office on his final day, he paused to look at 2 photographs on his desk. One showed him taking the oath of office as FBI director, full of hope and determination to reform the system from within. The other showed him at the signing of the Washington Act, the small scar on his temple visible standing alongside families who had lost loved ones to police violence. Between those 2 moments lay a journey that had transformed not just his own understanding, but the landscape of American policing. Had justice truly responded swiftly, as the viral headlines had claimed? Not initially. The system's first instinct had been to protect itself, to minimize and contain the damage. True justice had required sustained pressure, strategic thinking, and the courage to challenge powerful institutions. But responded eventually did not with perfect resolution, but with meaningful progress toward a more equitable system. Washington smiled slightly as he placed the photographs in his box. The scar on his temple had faded, but would never disappear completely. Like the system he had worked to reform, it carried the marks of past trauma even as it healed. As he walked out of the building, agents and staff lined the hallways in a show of respect. Many were young officers whose careers would be shaped by the changes Washington had initiated. Their diversity reflected another aspect of his legacy. The FBI now looked more like the country it served. Washington paused at the door for one final look back. "Keep pushing forward," he told the assembled agents. "The work is never finished." Then he stepped into the sunlight, a private citizen once more, but forever a symbol of what one person could accomplish when principle transcended self-preservation. What's your take on this powerful story of justice and accountability? Would you have had the courage to stand firm like Director Washington, even when facing resistance from the system? Comment below with your thoughts on police reform and racial justice in America. If you believe more stories like this need to be told, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more powerful narratives about the ongoing fight for equality. Share this video with someone who needs to understand the reality of racial profiling and how one person's courage can spark meaningful change. Thank you for watching this story of determination, principle, and the long road to justice. Remember, the work of creating a more just society is never complete. It requires all of us to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult. This powerful narrative teaches us that systemic racism affects everyone regardless of status or position. Even as FBI Director Washington wasn't immune to racial profiling, highlighting how deeply ingrained these biases are in our society. The story demonstrates that true justice requires both individual accountability and systemic reform. Neither alone is sufficient. Washington's composed dignity during the traffic stop contrasts sharply with the system's initial resistance to change, showing how those facing discrimination must often demonstrate extraordinary restraint while pursuing justice. His strategic approach, gathering evidence, building coalitions, and leveraging his position, illustrates effective pathways to reform. The breaking of the blue wall of silence reveals how courage can inspire others to stand for truth. Perhaps most importantly, this story shows that meaningful change requires addressing not just individual bad apples, but the institutional cultures and leadership that enable misconduct. Washington's journey from victim to change agent demonstrates how personal trauma can be transformed into positive social impact through principled, persistent action. His legacy reminds us that justice is never automatically granted, but must be continuously pursued, often at great personal cost. What would you do if faced with the kind of injustice Director Washington experienced? Would you have the courage to stand firm against a system designed to protect itself rather than serve justice? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Has this story changed your perspective on racial profiling and police accountability? Like this video. If you believe we need more leaders with Washington's integrity and principles in positions of power, subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories about individuals fighting against systemic discrimination and making real change. Share this video with someone who needs to understand the reality of racial bias in law enforcement and how one person's courage can spark meaningful reform. Thank you for watching this story of determination, principle, and the long road to justice. Remember, creating a more equitable society requires all of us to recognize injustice and take action no matter how difficult the path may be.